And our final speaker at this part is our chairman, Dr. Jim Lewthwaite. Jim, when you're ready.
Thank you very much, Steve. First of all, a slight change of presentation. Normally I just speak off the cuff in the general, about some general theme, but I want to make a particular point this time, and that is that we are the people that are backed by hard science, and our opponents radiate emotion. They have no scientific basis for their beliefs. It's simply wishy-washy liberalism. It does not correspond to biological and psychological data. That's why I'm going to quote extensively from this book, which I commend to you all. I've been reading it recently, and it opened my eyes in many respects. It's by the great Ed Dutton, who of course is an evolutionary psychologist who speaks most years at TBG. And it's about the grooming gang situation in Finland. Following on from what Steve has just said, Ed Dutton's interpretation of why the Finns were uniquely vulnerable to Muslim rape gangs in their major cities was that they were simply too nice. The Finns were an open, generous, warm-hearted people who welcomed refugees into their midst. They were told these refugees were fleeing war and persecution and had to be looked after, usual drivel. Then there was a massive outbreak of rape, which was only discovered when a half-Finnish, half-Moroccan citizen journalist started looking at the names of the perpetrators of assaults on underage girls and noticed they were almost all Muslims. Nothing about this had been reported in the mainstream media. The police denied everything. The politicians denied everything. This researcher assiduously looked into it, and eventually the authorities had to concede because they couldn't take away the names which had to be published in the court cases. So what I want to do is to read out selected parts of Ed Dutton's work to back up the fact that so far from being idiotic, moronic racists who spout drivel, who are motivated by fear and hatred, our case rests on solid science from the research of people like Robert Putnam, a liberal sociologist who was astonished to find that in multi-faith, multi-cultural, multi-racial communities, trust breaks down. He was a liberal, so he can't be accused of propagating far-right views. He simply looked at the evidence. Similarly, people like Kevin MacDonald and other evolutionary psychologists who point out that these behavioral characteristics cannot be smoothed over by assimilation or integration because they are inherited. They are biological. To change the biology of immigrants coming in, whether illegal or legal, is somewhat a proposition which I think would probably defeat most people in this room. We can't change their genes. And I can actually quote from Ed Dutton's book that they have actually narrowed down genes for specific psychic tendencies. So we are talking about science. They're trying to hide that from sight and keep on the usual stream of drivel that we are xenophobes and racists and we are motivated by fear and hatred. So to start at the beginning, how do we define the British Democrats? As every speaker this meeting has said, it's A, that we are ethno-nationalists, not civic nationalists. We don't believe you can turn a Bengali into an Englishman simply by putting him in a suit and a bowler hat. Secondly, we believe that there is a chance to save this nation through the electoral route and only through the electoral route. That is not to say that people that engage in culture wars on the internet are not helpful to our cause. The more ways we get at the establishment, the better. They are complementary. We should spend a lot less time. We in the British Democrats do not run down other parties and other movements. But of course, other parties and other movements run each other down and basically slag each other off quite unnecessarily, helping the cause of the left. Anyway, as I say, I've produced this as a sort of prologue to explain why there will be a number of quotations. I don't I don't want to bore you to death with the quotations, but they do back up the fact that we've got a scientific background and the opposition doesn't. Now, the first point is, as ethno-nationalists, we have a positive view of ethnocentrism. We think that a homogeneous society with shared traditions, shared values, shared genes is going to succeed, whereas a multifarious society based on a number of ethnic groups, which will usually by definition be in competition, everybody will want a bigger slice of the pizza than anybody else. So, as in a country like America, it's a question of which sort of hyphenated American has the upper hand at the moment, whether it's Jewish Americans, Italian Americans, Irish Americans, the old-fashioned WASPs, the Anglo-Americans, etc. They're all fighting for a bigger and bigger share of the pizza. So, inevitably, that leads to quite an unnecessary and unhealthy competition, which is why big American cities are becoming largely uninhabitable for people of our background. Anyway, so to begin, we take a positive view of ethnocentrism, but the biological fact is that even if we didn't, it's a fact of life, it's a fact of nature. There is actually a biological principle which is observed throughout the animal kingdom that you do more for your kin than for non-kin. It's called Hamilton's Law. It says that animals will, if necessary, make sacrifices, as it were, to make their group prosper. There is a fundamental distinction at the moment between the old-fashioned individual selection idea of the selfish gene and the more modern, but still in many ways heretical, belief that groups are selected for, which sometimes can mean that many of the anomalies in human behaviour can be explained away. So, in praise of ethnocentrism, shuffles pages. Tatu Vanhanen, an eminent Finnish psychologist, he's now dead, he was the father of a prime minister, got himself into a lot of hot water because he was a racial realist, a so-called racist. Tatu Vanhanen's 212 book to Ethnic Conflicts has shown that the more ethnically diverse a society is, the higher the degree of ethnic conflict. No surprise there, we all intuitively know that, but it's nice to know that when you run a computer program, the correlation between a country's ethnic diversity and its level of intensity of ethnic conflict is 0.66. Now, if it was 0.0, that would mean there's no correlation. But once it gets towards 1, then you've almost got a straight line correlation. Tatu Vanhanen got himself in a lot of trouble because he pointed out there's a direct straight line correlation, along with Richard Lynn at Ulster. He pointed out there is a straight line correlation between the mean IQ of a population and its economic and social success. So we don't have to give reparations to people in the third world, because the reason that they are backward and not developing is not because we crushed them with slavery or oppression or the British Empire, it's because they're not very bright. A sub-Saharan African has approximately 70% of the IQ of a West European. And before people say, well, all these tests will have been invented by white Europeans trying to bolster each other, the highest IQs are among Northeast Asians like Japanese, Chinese and Koreans. Why would white racists fix that? Well, they wouldn't. But ethnic diversity has got another side. Robert Putnam, that I previously mentioned in his book, A Pluribus Unum, has shown that ethnic diversity dramatically reduces trust and makes people much less inclined to invest in the common good. The result of this is that welfare states tend to collapse. You will do things for your kith and kin, you will make sacrifices, you'll contribute to the NHS, but you wouldn't do that once you realise, essentially, you're favouring other people's genes and they are living off your hard work. Why would you? So that's a basic reason why it's in our interest to maintain our ethnic homogeneity, because we know that every pound we put in is having a beneficial effect on the survival of our people. Once we begin to suspect that we're actually looking after other people who have no commitment to our future success whatsoever, who would be just as happy to move on to a third country if it was more profitable to do so, and therefore have no interest whatsoever in the long-term future of this country, well, you can see why it's perfectly rational to be ethnocentric. But there is another side to that, shuffles papers, which is that people are biologically ethnocentric, and we are by no means the most ethnocentric people on the planet. Japan is notoriously averse to allowing immigration. It has the further protection which all Northeast Asians have of being very high in ethnocentrism compared to Europeans based on the World Values Survey. A survey of American and Japanese students found that on all measures the Japanese were significantly more positively ethnocentric than the Americans. A survey in Toronto showed that most East Asian children were more positively ethnocentric. That means to say they think better of their own race, whereas Europeans are typically rather diffident about boasting their own values, especially after World War II. Pursuing this line of research, a group of scientists report that serotonin transporter gene polymorph is associated with ethnocentric behaviour. So a specific gene can be nailed down as causing ethnocentrism in human beings. Further research has shown that 70 to 80% of an East Asian sample carried the form of the gene which makes you more ethnocentric. Only 40 to 45% of Europeans, that's half as many, had this form of the gene. Across 29 nations, the more collectivist the culture was, the more likely to have that form of gene. So it's built into human beings. It can't be changed except by reprogramming them or re-engineering them. It's not a question of culture. So civic nationalism leads nowhere. I now lead on to the whole question of the grooming gangs. This is why Ed Dutton got interested in it. He moved to Oulu in northern Finland to take up an academic position and found himself noticing the frequency of these gang rapes committed almost exclusively by people of Muslim and Middle Eastern origins. The whole point is, I'll just give a single quote, research by experts in evolutionary psychology predicts that if you put a very large number of low-status males from the same ethnic group into a homogeneous community of a different ethnicity, then the result will be rape, and in particular, gang rape. A number of scholars, people like Lee Ellis and so on, are quoted to give the background information to this, and they're not all Europeans. Political scientist Karam Iqbal has observed that in a society with a large number of single young men, youth gangs develop, and they will often be violent, being drawn into terrorism under certain circumstances. Examples are given from India, for instance. Psychologist Lee Ellis concludes that males will adopt a strategy of gang rape. Ellis observes, similar backup, also Frank Salter, Henry Harpenting, highly regarded scholars. People are disposed to act in order to elevate the interests of their own ethnic group. If their ethnic group as a whole is of low status, the way they can achieve an elevation of status is through the gang rape of girls from the dominant ethnic group. So you come to that conclusion, as I mentioned earlier, research by experts in evolutionary psychology predicts that if you put a large number of low-status males from the same ethnic group into a different ethnic community, the result will be gang rape. This is backed up, for instance, by work in the Congo by a scholar called Mukwege, who noticed that rape was being used as a weapon of war, not only to hurt the females, but to bring down the males, because they felt they couldn't protect their females, they felt worse about themselves. They felt inadequate, they were terrorized, so it was a weapon of war to deliberately do this. And of course it goes back to prehistory. In Greece it was known as andropedismos. But in Islam, you have the added benefit that you're assured by the Quran that infidel women are available to anybody who can possess them with his right hand. That means if you conquer the enemy, the first thing you do is use the women as just sort of bits of meat. That is actually, in other words, you go to heaven and get greeted by 72 virgins if you do gang rape. Now, no other religion on the face of the planet, not Buddhism, not Hinduism, not Christianity, no other religion tells its adherents that committing gang rape is a good thing and will get you to heaven. But, of course, only as long as the people are non-Muslim, then they're basically less than human and can be treated accordingly. So, as I say, that's pretty bad news. Is there any good news in prospect? Well, as every speaker this afternoon has testified, things are changing. I would say they changed from the moment that Donald Trump was elected in the States. It was not expected. All the media proclaimed that he would lose, and yet he won. He won because there has been a seismic shift. We've had 50 to 60 years, I think you can date it back to 63 or 64, of continuous leftward drift. And from now on, I suspect you'll get the precise opposite, if only because there is no direction inherent in human history. As Matt Godden observed, it's not linear, it's cyclic. What the left have mistaken is perhaps a quarter curve of the cycle for an inevitable drive towards a future goal of the perfect socialist state. What they've forgotten is that that wheel is going to keep on turning. And it is going to turn through a number of conditions, one of which is an organic conservative model, conservative with a small c. In other words, back to the things which Steve was talking about, back to a homogenous community with strongly defended values with high degree of ethnocentrism. How can we see markers of this coming towards us? Well, one was the Tommy Robinson March. Now, people here will have different views about Tommy Robinson, but even the conservative figures given by the main media suggested that 150,000 people marched. Other figures by GB News reporters on the scene suggested more like 300,000. A sociologist commented that if you can get one person to march, they probably represent the actual views of somewhere between 10 and 100. So he hypothesized that anything up to 15 million people could have sympathized with those views, but simply weren't active enough, young enough, fit enough, brave enough to go out and march. But those marchers, therefore, represented a significant chunk of the voting public. Now that is, as I say, an indication that something is on the move. It's not just that parties like Reform are obviously voicing some sort of stirring, some sort of dissatisfaction with all the existing political parties. It's not even necessary that they will have the solutions. The point is that people are rejecting what has been going on for decades. They're looking for an alternative. Reform may not be that alternative, but that doesn't mean to say they're going to relapse into two-party rule by the Uni-Party, by Tories and Labour. It's impossible to believe that they will recross the Rubicon and go back to the status quo ante. If they can't find a solution in Reform, then they will look elsewhere, and that's where we have to come in. We have to keep the flame burning so that when they are dissatisfied with Reform, they can look somewhere and say, actually, there are people who do seem to be genuine about what they're suggesting, do seem to have a programme. It's not just about turning the boats back. It's a whole blueprint for Britain, which is recognisable and familiar, but we can't just reinvent the 1950s and abolish every invention that's occurred since then. We can't disinvent the social media, for instance. They're with us. So the Britain of the future will look different from the Britain of the 1950s, but what hopefully it will have is some pride in itself. And this cannot be achieved if we simply carry on saying, well, eventually these people will assimilate to us. No, they won't, for all the reasons I've already mentioned. They will not and cannot, and they don't want to. That's why they are clustering in their own ethnic enclaves with their own mosque and maintaining basically Pakistan in exile. It's simply colonization. We are being colonized, and as ex-colonizers, we should recognize what goes as a result of that. It's going to lead, quite simply, to a balkanization of Britain, to different ethnic enclaves fighting each other. It's not a future that anybody would relish. That's why when people say we're stirring up conflict, no, we're trying to prevent conflict. When Enoch Powell spoke out in 1968, he wasn't trying to stir up racial trouble. He could see racial trouble on the horizon and he wanted to stop it while it still could be stopped with the minimum amount of turning people back. Anyway, I was going to speak about some other things, but I hope I'm not outstaying my welcome. One of the things that you do notice is that fish rot from the head down. As Matt Godden pointed out, it's precisely the most educated in the sense of the most sent to university, which isn't necessarily the most wise in the community, quite the opposite. They go to university to be programmed as Marxists and emerge as woke liberals doing all the wrong things when they get their clammy hands on power. But there was an experiment conducted by J.B. Calhoun in about 1973 known as the Mouse Utopia experiment. What he did was to provide a sample of mice with a perfect environment. Needless to say, it had no cats in it. The main thing, however, was an abundance of food, the ideal temperatures for mice, the ideal nesting conditions, everything made mouse life perfect. Well, what do you think happened? The mice degenerated and then died out. The females started throwing young out of their nests, behaving aggressively. They didn't actually grow beards and dye their hair purple, but you get the picture. They didn't claim to be men and want access to men's toilets or anything like that. The men, meanwhile, became extremely effeminate. That's the male mice. The male mice became extremely effeminate, collected large numbers of Judy Garland records, you know the general picture, and this became soft and soft, ceased to take any interest in breeding whatsoever, and the mouse colony died out. Now that's very interesting because I once read about 40 or 50 years ago an account by a Marxist Spanish scholar on the origins of the knightly class in Spain. And it was very similar. What happened was that during the hard years after the fall of the Roman Empire, when the Moors were a constant threat, when Saracen pirates were roaming off the coast, kidnapping people and extending their rule across mainland Spain, communities clung together, if only for self-preservation. Castles were built, but they were manned by a single castellan and his wife, who might own between them one iron helmet and a couple of chainmail suits and a sword. They were regarded as serving the public by being the tower guard, if you like, the tower night watchman. They served the public, they did not own the castle, they lived humble lives on sort of, porridge and groats and all the rest of it. They were not in any way a different class of person. The richer the society became during the 11th and 12th centuries AD, the more class divisions appeared. Eventually, the castellans seized the castles, called themselves knights, and became a knightly caste. In other words, hard times made people good. Good times made people soft, weak, and divided. Now that's one of the problems, if you think about it, of post-war Britain. As Harold Macmillan said, you've never had it so good. The trouble is that very goodness has meant that we have, A, the growth of a lot of so-called spiteful mutants, in Ed Dutton's terms. People who would have died in Victorian conditions are now surviving and breeding. You think about programs like Shameless, about an underclass which reproduces itself like mice, but does nothing for the wider society, it just lives off it through benefits. These people are now swamping the rest of society, but simultaneously the head is rotting because the people who are most affluent have least reason to invest in the society because they don't think of it as something that protects them against a foreign enemy. They only think of abroad as somewhere to go skiing or to go sunning themselves on Spanish beaches, etc. All the defence mechanisms which a society in the Upper Paleolithic would have built up, all the mechanisms of things like altruism and generosity and sharing and looking after the common good, a situation in the Upper Paleolithic where if I don't help you get through a bad winter, you won't be around to help me through the next bad winter when it strikes my valley. All that sense, which again explains the Finnish generosity, they evolved in a particularly hard but predictable environment. A term used by Dutton and others is a slow life strategy. It means you don't spawn kids out like shotgun pellets. You have very few kids, but you look after them. You invest heavily in bringing them up properly. That's where the gay uncles and grannies come in. So it's a complete ecosystem in which you invest heavily in bringing your kids up with the maximum ability to survive in the worst possible winter. Meanwhile, down in Africa, food is abundant, but disasters can happen at any time. So the evolving life strategy is what's known as a little R strategy. It means you fire off kids like shotguns, you don't look after them, you drift from woman to woman and have hordes of, want a better word, illegitimate births. You then cease to have any interest in them. You do not bond very heavily because what's the point of bonding with somebody who might be hit by lightning next day, etc. They are two completely different strategies. They are polar opposites. Obviously, some societies are in the middle between them. We are close to the North East Asian, but not identical with the North East Asian model. We are significantly more open and therefore in some ways more vulnerable. But as I say, there is a scientific basis for everything that is happening. We may think of it as political activity, but it's also biological activity because we're looking after our genes. Not just our culture, we're looking after our genes because our genes create our culture. The reason we have had so many inventors in Britain is because of the particular genes which we have inherited from our ancestors and because of the way in which society has developed. The Industrial Revolution and the rest of it changed the world forever, in some ways positively, in some ways negatively, because it allowed suboptimal forms to proliferate. Anyway, as I say, the main point of what I'm trying to say is, so far from being agitators who are shouting racist slogans into a mob and inciting them, we are the people who are looking at the evidence and coolly, calmly and reasonably understanding the significance of behaviour. It cannot be reduced to mere emotions. It cannot be reduced to inheriting the kindness of Christianity while simultaneously denying God. Matt and I were having a discussion outside about the ironic nature of the modern left. It tries to propagate wishy-washy post-Christian sentiments while simultaneously criticising religion and disbelieving in God. Ed Dutton is actually, by his origins, a divinity student who turned to psychology, and he points out that religion has an adaptive advantage. Religious communities survive where irreligious communities fail because they have belief there's something big out there beyond them worth looking after. And that gives people a greater chance of survival than believing that there's nothing out there except the chance collision of a few atoms, and that there's no meaning to life. Religious people believe there is a meaning to life, they have a spiritual dimension, and it gives them biological advantages. Thank you very much.